Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Ramblings of a 42-Year-Old Man. Chris Smith here with you again today, and we are going to return to our Final Fantasy series today. Now we're going to take a bit of an offshoot from the main line. We just wrapped up Final Fantasy VII last week. We'll be jumping into Final Fantasy VIII again, but we're going to jump into that going on next week. That one's going to take me a little bit of time to put together, and we're just on spring break, and so I figured we'd do something a little smaller in between. And I'm trying to do these in kind of chronological order, mostly. And there was a game that was released between Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII. And we're going to start with that and then go into a bit of a series that this actually starts. So that game would be Final Fantasy Tactics, which was released on the PlayStation 1 not long after Final Fantasy VII came out. So we'll get into that game. We'll get into the two kind of sequels that came afterwards. We'll talk a little bit about the world that those all kind of revolve in, the difference in gameplay from your standard Final Fantasy game, and kind of where that originated from, and the legacy of this type of game, which is definitely a different type than most of our Final Fantasy games have been up to this point. So stay tuned for that. We'll be starting up with 1997's Final Fantasy Tactics. So 1997, right off the kind of hotbed release that was Final Fantasy VII, was obviously the best-selling game of all time for Final Fantasy. And right behind it, instead of like kind of continuing on with the mainline series, which again, Final Fantasy VIII was only a year later, so it's not like there was a big gap, but they kind of snuck in here this little game in the middle called Final Fantasy Tactics. It was also released on the PlayStation 1. This one was directed by Yasumi Matsuno. Now, he came over from Quest, which was the creators of the Ogre Battle series, which is a series of games I'll probably talk about later. I have not played many of those, but I will say the very first one, which is Ogre Battle March of the Black Queen, is one of my top 3 favorite games of all time. So we'll definitely be having a discussion about that eventually. The gameplay of that one is a little different than what Ogre Battle is mostly known for now, which is this tactical type RPG that Final Fantasy Tactics follows. So we'll get into a little bit of that later. But so he comes over to Square. Eventually, Quest actually gets completely bought out by Square, and so all of these people kind of get brought into the fold. Now, Final Fantasy Tactics, and again, some of this might be riding some of the coattails of Final Fantasy VII, but it is the 6th best-selling Final Fantasy game of all time. So, again, probably some of that carryover from Final Fantasy VII, also a little different than all the other Final Fantasies have been to that point, so it's kind of an outlier, a bit of a cult game, if you will, but really good selling, really good selling game. So that's a little background on Final Fantasy Tactics. We'll jump into some of the gameplay elements, because the gameplay for this is vastly different than what we've seen in Final Fantasy so far. So Final Fantasy Tactics is a tactical role-playing game, rather than your standard like Japanese turn-based role-playing game. What you've got, there's a world map that you can traverse, but it is similar to what we saw with, I think we talked about a little bit with like Mystic Quest, that Super Mario World type thing, where you have a set path that you walk down and you get to your areas. You go into these areas, and your battle maps, instead of being like a battle screen, it's actually a map, and this map is made up of squares. And your characters traverse square at a time down this map, going towards the enemies, which are usually on the other side of the map. And depending on what kind of class your character is or what their speed rating is, will determine how far you can move at any given time. Also, things like the terrain can affect it too. You can't walk through water as fast as you can walk through just flat land. You can't walk across mountains or cliffs as fast as you can just do on straight land. So that'll affect your path walking. And so the characters, like I mentioned, with the distance that they can walk can be affected by class. So this is a class system, similar to what we've seen in Final Fantasy before, where you've got your warriors, you've got your magicians, you got things like that. And you can level up those classes. You can upgrade classes to different ones. You can learn different abilities through all of these classes. You got JP, I believe they're called in the initial Tactics game. That you're able to use to learn abilities from these jobs as you're going forward. And also, as you accumulate more points, you can upgrade these jobs. Kind of like the class system change that we had way back in Final Fantasy 1, where a knight could become a warrior could become a knight, or a mage could become a wizard, things like that. You have a similar progression in this game. So yeah, what sets it apart is just that tactics style battle. And we've seen that, the reason why this kind of was originated by Quest is not that first Ogre Battle game, but afterwards, like they had Ogre Battle became kind of a tactical game. In fact, they have a Tactics Ogre game that also came out on the Game Boy Advance around the time that the sequel to this game came out. But they're very much like you got your kind of your battle screen. You move around. I think Sega had one similar to this called Shining Force. Maybe you've ever played that game, but kind of understand how this works. You know, you got your battle screen, you got enemies on one side, your guys on the other side, you're moving across, trying to get closer to each other, you get next to each other, you do an attack. If you got a ranged character, you can do attack from a little further away, things such as that. So definitely a difference from our normal Final Fantasy games, but this was, you know, kind of a breath of fresh air for some people who, you know, just played this giant Final Fantasy game, Final Fantasy VII, able to come into this maybe a little bit smaller, a little bit easier to grasp game, although I would say it's kind of a complex system. The class system itself is pretty complex as well. And it's definitely very dark in tone. This first Tactics game is very dark. They do get lighter as we go, but this one is kind of a very dark tone game. So, you know, I guess at this point in Final Fantasy history, we were all about the darkness. We'll get into some of the story mode and then the legacy of this first game in just a second. So, all right. So the story, again, the primary motive of this game is to get you to play and enjoy that tactical scenarios and stuff. So the story is a little light, but it is kind of a dark story. You know, you got the kingdom of Ivalice has just lost its ruler. Two different sides are trying to fight to take control, and so pretty much you're a knight stuck in the middle of this war. In fact, I think there's a port of this enhanced port that came out later called the War of the Lions. That's what it is. You got two different lions that are fighting this war, and you're kind of stuck in the middle. And you know, the story goes to some pretty dark places, but I'm not going to get deep into story mode on this because really, again, the main draw of this is just that tactical kind of fighting style. So when we talk about legacy of this one, so I just mentioned they ported it into like an enhanced kind of remake almost called the War of the Lions for the PlayStation Portable. And the world itself, Ivalice is we're going to be talking about that quite a bit going forward, not only with these 3 tactics games, but when we get to Final Fantasy XII, we're going to be talking about this world as well. So that is the initial Final Fantasy Tactics game, or the port, which is called Final Fantasy Tactics, The War of the Lions. And of course, this branched off into future sequels as well, continuing, getting back into Game Boy again, Final Fantasy back into, I know we talked about the original Game Boy Final Fantasy games way back weeks ago. And this next game that we're going to talk about is the first time that they have returned to a Game Boy system in over 10 years. So let's get into that one next. And that is it for Final Fantasy Tactics, the first game. So now the second game in the Tactics series, this one is Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Now this one was released on the Game Boy Advance in 2003. So again, last time we had a Final Fantasy game on Game Boy was Final Fantasy Legend 3, and that was back in 1993. So this is 10 years later, a new system later, you know, the Game Boy Advance system has color graphics and, you know, obviously a big upgrade on what we had for Game Boy. This one is produced by Yasumi Matsuno, who was the original director of Final Fantasy Tactics. He, again, came over from Quest with Ogre Battle. Also coming over with him was the director of this one, which is Yuichi Murasawa. All of them were part of the Quest company that created the Ogre Battle games, and then Square bought out Quest. And so pretty much the future Ogre Battle and the games like Final Fantasy Tactics still being done by the same creative team, but being done under the Square umbrella. Gameplay with this one, very, very similar to Final Fantasy Tactics. You got that same battle screen with the squares, and you're walking back and forth, and so you have that tactical RPG-ness. Excuse me. Changes here, though. You got a clan system, so instead of you just like walking around the world map, getting into battles on your way from kingdom to kingdom for this war that you're in, now you are taking jobs, you're taking missions for the clan. You know, you get rewards every time you finish a mission. You can open up different parts of the map if you finish certain battles. Instead of the 20 classes that you had in the first game, now you have 34 different job classes you can work with. You use AP points to learn abilities on those classes. You can also use them to learn more advanced versions of the classes that you're in. And then another change here, every time you get into one of the battlefields, there's a character called a judge who's just monitoring the battle. So they're just sitting there monitoring. And they have a set of rules depending on which battle you're in. But the rules could change. Maybe you can't use this kind of weapon, or you can't use this kind of magic, or you can't do this. And you need to follow those rules, or you can have penalties against you in the battle. Also different than the first game, instead of just all human characters, we have 5 different races that you can play through now. They're races that we'll see again in Final Fantasy XII, also the sequel to this Tactics game as well, because again, you're living in the world of Ivalice again. This is another game in that same world as the original, and the same world that we will be seeing going forward in a couple other games as well, which will bring us kind of into the story mode of this game. So the story of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is actually very meta. It's a very meta story. So you actually are in control of these kids who are kind of living in the real world. They play Final Fantasy games. You know, the Final Fantasy is actually a game series in this world. And what happens is they find a book that after reading it, they kind of go into this dream world of Ivalice. And so now they're living in the Final Fantasy world. And this book kind of makes your dreams a reality. So all these kids who have kind of hardships in the real world, they're able to be better than those hardships in this dream world. You know, the shy, quiet kid is now a fighter knight, or the one who's always picked on all the time is now the ruler, and the one who has, like, they don't like the color of their hair. Their hair is now this vibrant red color in the game. So it's kind of a wish fulfillment fantasy. But throughout the course of the game, they have to come to realize that, you know, they can't just live in this fantasy world. They got to get back home and live their lives. So that's kind of your story of this one. The legacy of this game, it is much lighter in tone than Final Fantasy Tactics. It's, you know, you're not... There obviously there's always wars and battles and stuff going on, but you're not having quite as dark as that war that you had in Final Fantasy Tactics was. The colors are brighter. The Game Boy Advance is definitely utilizing the fact that they're able to finally have this backlit, colorful system that you can use. The characters are much more vibrant and fun to play with. There's different races, so you got a lot of cool, different looking characters as well. And a lot of these same characters and races will be moving forward throughout Final Fantasy XII and the sequel to this game, which we'll get into next, which will be Final Fantasy Tactics A2. All right, so the third and final, as of now, Final Fantasy Tactics game is Final Fantasy Tactics Advance 2. It's called Final Fantasy Tactics A2. I believe they shortened it up. For one thing, it's not on the Game Boy Advance anymore. This has now been upgraded to the Nintendo DS system, because that was the new handheld system that was coming out. This was in 2007. This came out, I believe, right after Final Fantasy XII did on the PlayStation 2. So again, directed by Yuichi Murasawa, who had done all those Ogre Battle games for Quest. Gameplay is pretty much straight on, similar to what Tactics Advance was. More jobs. You have up to 50 playable job classes. A couple extra races are now joined. You have 5. I'm sorry, you had 5 in the previous game. Now you have 7 different races you can play with. Some of the jobs you have now are very specific to the races too. You can't do a certain job on a human. You can only do it on a Viera, or you can only do a certain job on a Moogle. You know, things like that. And now abilities are learned through weapons and armor. So you equip a weapon, you equip an armor, and you learn the ability that is associated with that weapon and armor. And so other than that, gameplay is very much similar to especially when it comes to the darkness, or the lightness in this case, is more similar to the Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. It's a brighter, lighter, fun game, which is kind of a palate cleanser a little bit, because again, this is that same world that Final Fantasy XII and all these other Tactics games. And the Final Fantasy XII is a very dark game set in this world, so it's kind of... they decided to go more fun with this one in that same world as well. And you'll see a lot of similarities of characters, races, enemies, and stuff that cross all these different games. So the story of Final Fantasy Tactics A2, the world of Ivalice returns again. This time it is not a dream world, but you do, again, similar to what we had in the last game, you have a character living in the real world, and he finds this book, and he falls into it. But instead of it being a dream world this time, this book has some special power to open portals between worlds. So Ivalice is a real world this time, not a dream world, but it is not the world that this our protagonist actually is from. So the main character is teleport through the book into this other world, and he has to kind of fight his way back to get back to his normal world. So this is in the world of Ivalice. It takes place after Final Fantasy XII, all the events that took place there. And some of the characters from that game will cameo in this. You know, we'll talk about Final Fantasy XII in a few more weeks, but you know, the main characters like Vaan and Penelo, who we'll talk about then, make cameo appearances in this game as well. You actually can play with them a little bit. I don't know that they're permanent characters. I've never actually played this one myself, but I do know that they do show up to play with at certain points. So, legacy of this one is, again, it is part of that. They called this the Ivalice Alliance. So around this time, they had Final Fantasy XII. They had this game. And then they had another DS game called Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings that we'll talk about a little bit when we get to Final Fantasy XII in the future. All those were kind of centered around the same world and kind of tied together with the same kind of creative team behind it as well. Again, this one sticks with the lighter tone of Tactics Advance, not the much darker tone that we had with the original Tactics or with Final Fantasy XII. And being on the DS, they were able to utilize the dual screen technology that the DS had to kind of update some gameplay aspects and stuff like that. I remember from the DS days, there were not a lot of games that really utilized that two-screen system well, but the ones that did, you know, you could have a lot of fun with. So artwork and character jobs and stuff that were used in this game, Square actually took those and created a mobile game series called Crystal Defenders. There's like 3 or 4 of those games, I think, now, and they're kind of based on the basis of from this game. So kind of the legacy of this, and then we'll kind of get into the legacy of this kind of Tactics series overall. So for Final Fantasy Tactics as a whole, you know, obviously we had these 3 games, Tactics War of the Lions, Tactics Advance, Tactics A2. The same similar gameplay is now in a lot of the Ogre Battle games that are also owned by Square. We just had a re-release of Tactics Ogre on Final Fantasy V just last year. I have not had a chance to get that one yet. I have played the original. That was I don't even know if it was Game Boy Advance. I think I played that on Game Boy SP or something back in the day. I don't even know. But Tactics Ogre was very similar to Final Fantasy Tactics, just using characters and job classes from the Ogre Battle series rather than the Final Fantasy series. So this style of gameplay is you know, there's a whole bunch, especially now in the mobile game world. You can find this kind of game all over the place in the mobile phone world. But I would say Ogre Battle was the first time I kind of came across it, or the Shining Force games for the Sega as well. And then Final Fantasy, you know, kind of took that system and said, hey, let's plug these favorite job and characters from Final Fantasy in it, and you know, they did well. Like I said, the very first one was the 6th best-selling Final Fantasy game of all time. The sequels never quite got up to that reach, but again, fun handheld games that were kind of a return to Final Fantasy on the Game Boy and the handheld systems, be able to take them with you and have a good time with them. So a lot of fun. I've played through the first 2 games. I've never finished either of them. I find them they're a little complicated for handheld games. You know, so you kind of want something with your handheld game where you just kind of sit down and play and maybe turn your mind off a little bit. You got to focus a little bit more than that. And even the first one being on a PlayStation is much more intense. But we'll be back next week with Final Fantasy VIII, get back on the mainline series and go forward from there. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and I will talk to you all soon.